Hey everybody, welcome to Latter-day Struggles. This is your host Valerie. Pleased to be with you all here again today, once again with my sweetie Nathan. Hi Nathan Hamaker.
Hello, good to be back. How are you?
Very good. We are here for episode 4 of a multiple part series where we are tackling something that I am just absolutely obsessed with right now. And I'm sure, if you're, not living under a rock, you are probably, if not obsessed, at least somewhat interested in the intersection of politics and religion, mostly because I personally feel like on the news, in our culture, in our society right now, especially if you're in the United States of America, there is a lot going on having to do with our political climate and the impact that the current Donald Trump presidency is having, not just on the country, but on the entirety of the world, and how some religions and their leaders are choosing to speak up and how some are not. And this is something that I have been interested in for a good little while, especially as we have relocated from the Midwest to the West Coast, and the religious climate is radically different, as probably wouldn't surprise anybody. But I'm just thinking to myself, wow, what is going on? I want to dig into this and understand it better. To that end, we have been talking about this, and not just high level, but we're really digging deep into this. So we're about halfway through this series, and as we get started here, Nathan, I'm wondering if you would kind of just pick up where we left off in our last episode, where we spent our time talking about these two different kinds of religions of legitimacy and religions of transformation, and how whether one is a legitimacy-based religion or a transformation-based religion really does inform or can help us better understand when they speak up and when they stay silent. So take it from there.
So the legitimacy-based religions are religions that are essentially more concerned about their own survival than they are about the effects that they bring into the world. Okay. And so a legitimacy religion is one that's going to be more preoccupied with power, with structure, with order. And in a lot of cases, they're the ones that are interested in maintaining status quo. And they kind of want to always be on the good side of the government because they are literally more interested in just surviving than they are in affecting change. And then you have what we would call the transformation type of religions or spiritual practices, which are really not concerned about hierarchy and structure and power or who gets the credit or any of those kinds of things. They just want to help people evolve into higher moral beings. And so their focus is on, hey, we need to do the right thing. We don't really care who gets the credit. It doesn't even have to be us. We just want to make people better. And so those two different kind of philosophies sometimes will play out a little bit differently in the public realm in cases like this.
So one of the things that we have been talking about and will continue to talk about is the Latter-day Saint formal stance of political neutrality. And what we are proposing is there is no such thing, that no religious tradition is truly politically neutral. And in our next episode, we're actually going to go deeply into how there is a real intersection between religion and politics. It cannot be avoided. However, we can understand where the religious system is in its stage of awakening based on which causes it chooses to take up and which causes it chooses not to take up. Okay. And so that's where we kind of ended off last time, walking through a whole bunch of religious systems and how they are sort of taking up the cause, many causes, trying to sort of confront dominator hierarchies, whether it be around race or color or wealth distribution, These are transformation religious systems. They are further on in their life cycle, in their psychological development. And so they attract people to them that also are further along in their psychological development. And concurrently, religious systems that are more legitimacy based are simply religious systems that are earlier in their own life cycle. Okay, so they are earlier in their own psychological development. And by default, what that means is they are more concerned about protecting themselves and power structures that help them stay or feel safe. And so many of these systems that are staying silent right now in 2026 are actually making a statement without even saying very many words, right? What they're making a statement about is that they are, in fact, interested in the protection of authority, male authority. Also, frequently, they're wanting, oftentimes, again, they're not saying this explicitly, but if you're not speaking into the problems or what many of us see as problems in 2026, what you're communicating is, to some degree, uh, tell me if you think this is too strong, Nathan, but I fear that it's communicating a defensiveness or a protectiveness around white, cisgender, heterosexual, male authoritarian power structures, because that's what we are witnessing in real time in the way the United States is governing itself, or at least the leadership, and also in some ways, some of the branches of government are sort of letting this go and are not standing up against Trump and those who have all the power. What are your thoughts on that? Am I being too strong there?
Well, it's hard to say. I think to know exactly what people's motives are. I do think that when you look at what's going on in our country right now, that might be a pretty legitimate observation because there's no question that our current political leader is more interested in his own image and in maintaining his own power than he is in any kind of moral system. And I think that's kind of what we've tried to unpack a little bit here is that spirituality is trying to educate the moral minds or to provide values that people then will implement into the political system. And right now we're getting the opposite. We're getting a system that is trying to instruct us on power and ego, kind of in this almost like in a reverse flow. And yes, right now, what we are being taught by our system is power, violence, you know, disrespect for women, disrespect for the immigrants, things that we've already talked about. And yes, when religions don't speak out against those kinds of behaviors, by default, what they are supporting then is that white male patriarchal violent power structure.
And I want to make sure I want to make clear that I don't think, well, I know this is not how I'm feeling, and I don't think this is how you're feeling either, Nathan. So to jump in after I say what I'm going to say. But I'm not here to say that I think the LDS Church explicitly is saying we like violence and exploitation of women and children. That's not what we're saying. What I think we're saying, and what I'm saying at least, is that by default, when one doesn't speak up against it, one is communicating that this is not one of their prime directives around what they see as the most important thing that needs reform.
Right.
Okay. And I think it could be, again, this is in the unconscious for the most part, is what I would posit. And again, back to what I frequently return to is always want to give the benefit of the doubt because these are representative of stages of moral development. And so churches, wherever they are doing the best they can for where they are in their level of consciousness. And to that end, it may feel like a very moral choice for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to not speak up in certain ways because they are deeply committed to a patriarchal theology. In other words, from their perspective, they don't really have a choice in the matter. God is male, and God's power is based in the male body. And so it doesn't feel to them political.
Right. Yeah, and we're going to talk about this a little later,
Yeah.
but you've kind of touched on it already, and I think it's good to just kind of finish up your thought here. One of the reasons why churches may struggle to speak out against something that is clearly wrong is because they're so enmeshed in it themselves, right? So you can't speak out against white male patriarchal power when your whole structure is based on white male patriarchal power. And so, deep down inside, there may be people within the religious system who feel uncomfortable about what's going on in the country. But when they get down to what makes them feel uncomfortable, if their system that they're in is already dealing with that shadow, you can't speak up about it. So, I don't want to jump too far ahead because I know we're going to touch on this more. We're going to touch on the shadows of the church and how it affects their ability. But you kind of hit on it a little bit, and so I just wanted to bring that up for a sec.
Well, it bears repeating, so we'll come back to it, and I don't think we can speak too much towards it because it's a big topic, but it in the spirit of staying with it for just a second longer, I'm trying to remember, it was from the first episode of the series. Nathan, is it the article of faith, what, 10? We recognize, let me think. It's about kingdoms, like that we support kings and
Oh,
principalities. Remind me?
we believe in being subject to kings, magistrates, rulers, and so
Yes.
forth.
Okay. Thank you. So, Article of Faith 12. I had to jump back to the notes here. Article of Faith 12. We believe and teach that members should be subject to kings, presidents, rulers, magistrates, and obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law. So, that's one of our primary guiding principles of Mormonism, which puts us squarely in the developmental space of an earlier stage of development, which outsources authority and says one of the most important things we can do and can teach is to be subject to outside rulers. Mind you, it's not talking about being subject to our internal compasses. And that right there, once again, puts us in a space of silence in this moment when so many other religious systems that are in a different stage of their own life cycle, further on in their own consciousness development, their prime directive to their membership is not to be subject to kings and principalities, or I'm confusing principalities and powers. That's some other scripture somewhere. But to kings and rulers and magistrates and whatnot. And so keep that in mind that developmentally, both of these types of religious systems, both those that are interested in transformation and those that are interested in legitimacy, earnestly feel that they are faithful Christians. And they believe that their structure and what they're doing is the right one. And so I think we just need to keep that in mind because it's not productive, in my opinion, to not have this conversation, clearly, because we're having it. But I also want to be gracious with what we're talking about is levels of development, and that both perspectives represent a different worldview, a different point of view. But it does also bear having a conversation about so that we can understand what's going on, because even though I want to presence the earnestness of both of these stances, both of these levels of development, I also think it's important to keep in mind that to say one is politically neutral is categorically not the case. It's not the case. What is happening right now is each of these types of religious systems are articulating where they are developmentally, and also they are articulating what do they think is significant in terms of moral consequences. And I've quoted this a few times, but it's important. Back in that official statement that the church made about me, they said they reserve the right to address issues that it believes to have significant moral consequences or that directly affect the mission, teachings, or operation of the church. Now, keep in mind, once again, embedded in that very statement is an expression of their own development. We are worried about how this impacts us. Okay, and Nathan just mentioned a second ago that when you're in a transformation religion, that's not what you're thinking about. You're thinking about the protection of others, even if, like, it's not about protecting you as an institution. It's about what's best for the larger, greater good of humanity.
Yeah. So, that statement actually does mention both things, right?
Mm.
It says that the church can speak out on moral matters, which is what a transformation kind of religion should be doing. And then it also says, or anything that, could essentially affect the existence of the church, which is the legitimacy version of religion. So it really talks about both there. And I think where I would struggle a little bit is that I feel like, first of all, if you include a statement of legitimacy, you may end up with a conflict of interest. You could end up in a position where your morals push you one way, but your legitimacy pushes you the other way. I don't know that's always the case, but there's a potential conflict there when you try to state both as being important.
Sure. I think I might want to ask you to clarify that, but I mean, let me read this again. It's they address issues that they believe to have significant moral consequences. So in other words, to me, that is a statement of what they think matters. Like, in other words, from our perspective, what is of highest moral consequence is protecting issues around power, gendered power, racial power, economic power. Like, do you see what I'm saying? Like, I think those are two different ways of saying the same thing, but I'm happy for you to disagree with me.
Yeah, I kind of read that differently. I read that as churches can speak out on morality, and churches can also take a stance if it's self-protective. So I don't know. I don't know what their intention is, but I think either way, it's problematic because if I'm right and it's like, hey, we can speak out on morality and we can also be self-protective. I think there's going to be conflicts of interest. I think there's going to be times when your morality would call for you to act in a way that may not be in your best institutional self-interest. And if you're right and it's just saying, hey, these are two different ways of saying the same thing, that our morality is in the self-protection, again, you're going to have the same problem. You will be silent on the moral guidance that religious and spiritual institutions are supposed to provide to the people to help make just and fair governance.
Yes. Yes. So said, I guess one last way of thinking about this that I think maybe we're both sort of saying the same thing, Nathan, is it is possible that based on where one is in their level of consciousness development, a church or an individual that goes to that church, right? They will choose what their level, like what is significant to them in terms of moral consequence, will determine whether or not they speak out. Am I saying that?
Yeah. So what you're saying is, I think, is that basically you can tell where a
Yes.
spiritual institution is in its development by what they choose to speak at, what they consider to be moral consequence, or in the case of what I was saying, if they choose legitimacy over a potential moral consequence. It just gives you a lot of information about where that church and those leaders are in their spiritual development.
And those that are protecting themselves as an institution are by default in that legitimacy space.
Right.
Right.
Which is an earlier stage of development.
Correct. So, okay, we're going to pivot for just a second for this next part of our episode today, because I wanted to take a step back and kind of just start introducing you to what Nathan and I are going to be doing, sort of like, again, setting the stage today, but then really going deeper into this in the next episode of this series. I want to talk a little bit about this intersection between religion and politics. Okay. So fundamentally, how are religion and politics interwoven? Okay. So this is really big picture. Okay. We're going macro here. So if you think about this, religion and politics are shapers and they're shaping society and they're shaping each other. Okay, so they are co-constructing each other and society at large. Religion impacts how we experience society. Politics also is an influencer of society, and they are both influencing society. So you could say that religion and politics are both participating and co-constructing society at large, but also each other. Okay. And you might be asking the question, well, what do you mean by that? Explain more. Okay. I'm so happy to do so. So human beings and the human race goes through, we grow in like, there's a life cycle of development in the human being from babyhood to, the elderly years. And that's the same with the human race. Okay. And if you're interested in this topic, like, I'm here for you. Okay. Because this is what a lot of what I'm talking about in my Friday fellowship, that this consciousness awakening is not just an individual endeavor. It is actually something that is happening at the level of civilization. And it helps us make better sense of levels of development, not just within the human being, but within institutions, inclusive of countries and churches. Okay, so each institution of faith and each individual goes through varying stages of development towards gradually becoming more and more awakened, more and more conscious, more and more capable of love. So you have religions of legitimacy on the earlier end of the spectrum. Religions of transformation are on the later end of the spectrum of consciousness development. And they are going to attract human beings that match where they are themselves. So people in earlier stages of development, myself and Nathan included, we hung out in sort of devout Mormonism for the vast majority of our lives because we ourselves were in that level of development. We needed legitimacy. We needed identity. We needed structure. We needed instruction. And we were there for a long time, as were many of you, if you're listeners here, as are many of your loved ones. Okay, so that right there is where we were until we evolved. And so individuals evolve through their lifespans, but also through the centuries. Religious systems themselves also mature. That's why you're going to find more maturity in some religious systems that are much older than Mormonism. It has done me no end of good when I really get frustrated with Mormonism to keep in my mind's eye that we are not even 200 years old. We are but a toddler. And some of the older faith traditions, although they're still, not perfect, they manifest much more capacity for inclusion and for love. And they look out more, for more people on the margins because they are evolutionarily more mature. Okay, so how does this connect with with politics and with the law? Let's jump into how does that work? Okay, so as a human race evolves and develop, there is something called a center of gravity. It's kind of like if you think of any given culture, it's kind of like where most people are in their level of maturity. And every culture has its own center of gravity. So if you think about, say, for example, let's just stay with Mormonism because it's our thing. There is a center of gravity in Mormonism where most people hang out in this sort of, I would say, the more devout, traditional believing Mormon. That's probably where, would you say that's the center of gravity, right? Is that fair to say?
I think it's definitely the center of gravity of the leadership.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
The members themselves, I think, are probably more varied and probably a little bit more liberal than the leadership. But for the power structures,
Yeah.
I would say that's where the power hangs out.
Yeah. Okay. And also where the most vocal of the membership in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In other words, whether or not it's really there, I think there's argument that it's not, that there is the center of gravity is probably a little bit further developed than what you may hear on any given Sunday.
Right.
But perception wise, and that which is sort of explicitly shared and expressed, kind of situates the center of gravity of the church around where the leadership is as a more kind of conservative body. Okay. So if that's the case, in every culture or microculture, like in Mormonism, there is going to be a leading edge of development, meaning there are going to be people who are awakening slightly sooner or slightly more so quickly.
They're just they're just a little further along in their psychological development.
Thank
right?
you. Yes. And so that is the leading edge of development. And that's how like any culture evolves is you have your reformers, your people that belong to a certain community, but they are having an awakening experience and they are wanting to share it with their own people, with their own culture. And so at the center of gravity, you have a lot of encouragement to sort of stay there as if that is, the place to stay forever. That's, having arrived. And then you have these cultural reformers, these people at the leading edge that are interested in moving the culture or the microculture in this case forward. Now, these people at the leading edge of development invite reform. And if you get enough people, if you kind of hit a point of critical mass, this awakens enough of the culture to where you will find within society a pressuring to create laws that protect certain people that were not protected beforehand. Okay. Am I making sense, Nathan?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm trying to kind of walk you through is how does a culture or a society awaken? A culture or society awakens when people at the center of gravity come together and have enough courage to have a voice to say, I'm going to use the example of the civil rights movement and racism as a good example because it crosses politics and religion really, really well, especially when we're thinking about Mormonism. Okay, so in the 50s and 60s, you started having some rumblings of some people that were starting to sort of come together and say, this is not okay. We are not treating Black people the same as we treat white people, and we are all created equal. Okay, this was not a majority opinion, by the way, when this started rumbling around. But there started to be enough of a critical mass where people more and more were kind of scratching their heads and saying, you know what? I think they're right. And by the way, one of the most significant reformers happened to be a Baptist preacher, Martin Luther King Jr., who, as a form of his, as an extension of his religious leadership, he felt deeply called as a transformation religious leader to step into this civil rights space and use as part of his ministry an awakening voice to the masses to say it's not okay. It's not okay to be treating Black people like this. And so, as the civil rights movement sort of took place, caught fire, eventually this social fervor, which was led by a religious leader, eventually became law. Laws were created to prevent people from being explicitly racist. Okay, now this is an important piece here when we're talking about this, the convergence of the religious and the political. Even though during the civil rights movement, people could, they became, it became against the law, say, for example, to not give seats to Black people in a bus or to segregate children in the schools or to have a separate bathroom or drinking fountain between white people and Black people. That became explicitly illegal. However, you cannot legislate the soul. You cannot create a law to prevent people from being racist. All you could do was prevent people from explicitly being racist. And that's the very first step of transformation of a society. You create laws that don't let people act out in racist ways explicitly, although we very well know all you have to do is look at the prison systems in 2026, and we know that we're still being racist in the United States. Make no mistake. But the very first step you have to take in awakening mass consciousness is to start to create laws to prevent explicit harm from being done. And those who are pressuring the creation of these laws are those that come from the leading edge of consciousness. And oftentimes those are religious leaders and people at the leading edge of consciousness in their transformation-based churches.
Yeah. And so then the opposite side of that is the legitimacy-based churches, right? So the churches that were on the wrong side of the civil rights movement, aka the LDS church, right? Because as people are moving into this higher level of consciousness, they're trying to pull with them the center of gravity. They're trying to pull public opinion. So This is an example of where spiritual guidance from religious leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., for example, okay? But there are other examples of good spiritual leaders who led political change, like Gandhi, right? Like Desmond Tutu. And so they're trying to, as transformational leaders, like you said, pull the center of gravity and also change the laws, right? So we talked about this. One of the jobs of spiritual systems is to use their morality to change laws. But when you are a legitimacy church, when you are worried about structure and order and power domination, and in the case of the LDS church, truth claims, right? Like everything we do comes from God, you get stuck because we have a priesthood and temple ban. We have a doctrine that says that our black brothers and sisters were unfaithful in the premortal existence and therefore are not eligible for temple and priesthood blessings in this life. And as the world is changing, we're getting left behind. And when we claim, hey, the reason we have a prophet is because the prophet can see around the corner, we should be on the leading edge. We should have been at the forefront. We should have been at the forefront and saying, hey, we really screwed this up, but let us show you the example. Let us be the first to integrate. Let us be the first to remove these things. But we didn't because we were a legitimacy church based on truth claims. Okay. But to your point, okay, and you mentioned this at the beginning, and I want to circle back to it. Sometimes religious systems change the political environment, like our good civil rights leaders you mentioned. And sometimes it is the political system that begins to change the church. And I know we're going to go into this more in the next episode, so I don't want to get too far ahead. But the LDS Church was one that was brought along because the political environment was changing, and we basically got into a place where we had no choice. And so, it shouldn't be this way, but you are correct in the sense that sometimes it is the political system that moves ahead of the church system and causes the church system to change its value system.
I think we can actually go there right now. But before we do, I just want to heighten what you just said a second ago, Nathan. This is the corner that some legitimacy-based churches paint themselves into. This is the corner into which many churches paint themselves. Okay. If you're a legitimacy church, sometimes what you do, and by golly, this is just such a tragedy, but it happens, and it happens fairly often, and it happens fairly often in the LDS space, is we take our legitimacy fears or focuses that, again, remember, legitimacy is about protection. It's fear oriented because developmentally, that's where early stage faith is. It's more oriented around fear and sort of comfort, safety, belonging, and protection. And so what they do is they take the topics of what they're afraid of, which causes the creation of dominator hierarchies, and they turn it into God's truths, right? So it's not so much about we made a mistake and we have been racist, but it's more around our church has an everlasting doctrine to where God is racist and there's nothing we can do about it. And so when one takes an earlier level of development, which by default includes all sorts of dominator hierarchies, many of which are very sexist and racist, among other things. And then they turn it into God's law. It becomes incredibly uncomfortable to undo that, especially because as a legitimacy-based religion, you're basing your identity around your chosenness in God's, you're the favorite, right? You're the favorite kid. You're the best, the truest church. Whereas by the time you hit transformation religion, you've kind of like washed your hands of all that business and you recognize that the God doesn't have a favorite and your definition of God, generally speaking, has also changed. And so legitimacy-based religions have multiple problems in moments of this nature because of their protectiveness, because of the truth claims that they, by the truth claims become their identity. And then it becomes a question of like almost ego protection and legitimacy itself, like my legitimacy in the eyes of God as I have claimed to be a true church, and it becomes just an extreme corner. Now, but the deal is, as we've seen several times before, when we have as a church painted ourselves into many a corner around race, for sure, to stay with the topic of the moment, but also around the issues of marriage. Right? I mean, we are a church that has defined and redefined and redefined marriage oh so many times. And as Nathan mentioned, we might resist culture, but we also are molded by and sometimes actually do find ourselves conforming because of culture and politics. Let's just spend a second talking about this. Will be the last thing we share today as we move into our next topic. But there are times where religious systems that are legitimacy based do finally jump on board. Okay, so I think we should stay with the civil rights movement, with the temple priesthood ban, and how it took the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints several extra years to jump on board in name. And then, of course, we still haven't really admitted that which needs to be finally said out loud, which is, you know what, we made a mistake. We made a mistake. Joseph didn't build this into the original doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was inserted later. It was never the right thing to do, and we are sorry. But they didn't do that. But what did end up happening is there was a lot of things going on socially. I'm going to let Nathan take this up because I think it has to do with BYU basketball, if I'm not mistaken. And so there were some very random things that actually finally caused, the dominoes to fall on that topic. And I know it's not just BYU basketball, but I'm inclined to believe that was one of the pieces. So,
Well, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was a lot of pressure at BYU to integrate as it was really, really behind. And I think it came actually more from the football program. There was this very famous interaction between the University of Wyoming and BYU, where some black players from the University of Wyoming refused to play a football game against BYU, and they were kicked off the team. And BYU did nothing to defend those gentlemen. And it became a really big national story. And honestly, I do think it was kind of one of the first cracks where people really began to realize that this had to change. We could not, as a church, be a healthy part of a normal integrative society if we continued to behave this way. Now, again, I don't think the church changed their policy because of the Wyoming 7, but I think it's a very classic example of how people were beginning to realize we could not go on. And I also want to say this, years later, BYU brought the Wyoming 7 back to Provo Stadium and they honored them for saying, hey, thanks for standing up. But even still, they never apologized for the circumstances under which these gentlemen had to make a stand in the first place. And so while I do appreciate that BYU, this is a side, I'm sorry, I'm off topic, but while I do appreciate that BYU brought them back and, gave them a standing ovation at Provo Stadium, even still, Val, we continue to stand by this ridiculous, well, it was God's will until 1978, so no apology can be offered. And BYU itself is also getting pressure to get more black students into just its general population. And so there were questions about whether BYU would continue to be accredited and so forth. And so, again, a microcosm of a big problem for the church in general. They were not going to be able to integrate into society unless they changed their policies.
okay, so great and much appreciated rabbit trail. I know if I ever introduce BYU sports, I have to just, sit tight for a minute. But I did it. I introduced it. I invited it. So larger question is why do legitimacy religions sometimes finally jump on board, specifically our own home faith, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Although this is not, of course, just an LDS thing, but oftentimes we can notice in our own, relatively short history, it comes down to social pressure, the media or social consequences that are large enough to outweigh the inconvenience of maintaining the status quo. In other words, there are some issues where the church maintains to this day that they're going to die on this hill, right? I'm not sure if the church may die on the hill of LGBTQ issues. I'm legitimately concerned about that. And that social pressure may not ever be enough to where they're going to take a pause and reevaluate and probably not say we are wrong and sorry, but in some way, uh, catch up with the restoration of truth, which is that all of God's children are beloved and are equal and deserve all of the equal rights in all institutions, right? And so social pressure is a big piece of what pressures legitimacy religions to finally move forward. On the flip side of that, one of the other things, and I guess this is sort of this, it's kind of if you pick up the stick, you got to pick up both sides. Another motivation is the loss of social capital because the gap between where the culture is and what the religion is practicing becomes so broad and stark as to become ridiculous. I think you were kind of starting to talk about that with the racial thing, right, Nathan? Because by the time BYU was at this point in the late 70s, this is well into the civil rights movement,
Right.
right? And so again, you can't require the soul to stop being racist. Sometimes that takes a few generations. And I was just thinking, just got chills as I was thinking about this. God bless a couple of my grandparents, wonderful humans, very racist. I have vivid memories of this. And there's not a drop of blood of racism in any of our four children that I can
No.
think of. So that's only two generations, people. And so even though my grandmother and my they were people were protected against them because of the law, but they couldn't change their hearts, right? Because of so much of like the false traditions of our parents, like generations of racism had been baked into them to where it's not reasonable to believe that you create a law and change a soul. But you do create a law and it awakens social consciousness so the children are less racist and their children may not be racist at all.
Right.
Okay? And so what you're doing here is you're looking at what is happening as those that are kind of lagging behind. And in the case of the LDS church, as the years are going by, it's just simply becoming socially unacceptable to have institutionalized racism. And I'm here to say, I think we're almost there with institutionalized patriarchy. Maybe not quite yet, because Catholicism still does it, but we're getting closer and closer in this day and age to where institutionalizing um, this gendered power hierarchy is becoming more and more ridiculous.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the right point because as our daughters and our granddaughters are going to be raised in a society where outside of the church they will have equal opportunity in every endeavor, right? I mean, we are going to have a female president of the United States someday. We are going to have more and more females moving into CEO positions and moving into other positions of political. And everywhere our daughters are going to see that, and our granddaughters are going to see it. And patriarchy is going to completely, well, not completely, but patriarchy will continue to melt away more and more and more. And as the stark contrast between certain churches who are holding on to patriarchy and the rest of everybody else becomes wider and wider, eventually the daughters are going to say, either this church needs to change or I can't be part of this church anymore.
Correct.
And so you're going to get the attrition, and that gap will become so glaring that the churches will either adopt better policies or they will disappear into insignificance, essentially.
Right. And so just keeping in mind where we have heard it framed around how it used to be only just within the last half century that much of certainly the Western civilization was on board with God, and now they have departed. The irony is it's just the opposite, is that we are awakening to greater light and truth. Ironically, I can see this as the term restoration very deeply resonates with me, a restoration of truth around the equality of all of the children of God. And that's awakening to human beings. And it is actually the opposite. It's the churches that maintain power hierarchies around race and gender and other inequalities. They are the ones that are departing from or maintaining lower levels of consciousness as the world at large, or much of the world, is experiencing greater light and truth.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize exactly what you're saying, because to say that the reason that people are leaving organized religion is because they've lost God is in fact not really the true story for the vast majority of people that we work with. What they've lost is the white patriarchal, hierarchical God of a church of legitimacy. That God has died. You're absolutely right. But what has filled the gap in many cases, and I want to say everybody, but in many cases, what has filled the gap, and what has filled the gap for a lot of the people we work with in the latter-day struggle space, is a God that is more expansive. It's a God that is about love, not legitimacy. That's a God that's about service, not power. It's a God that chooses to speak up about moral issues rather than protect their own ego and self-image. That's the God that people are finding. But from an LDS perspective, it looks like the death of God, because that's the God that they still believe in. And that God has died.
Right.
Goodbye,
Yeah.
God.
Thank you. So yes. So what I think you're saying, Nathan, is that very more so than ever in the 21st century, Western Christians, inclusive of many, many members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, are participating in an awakening. In other words, we are evolving upward. We are awakening, and the God of the mythic, grandfatherly, Old and New Testament, who we need to appeal to and pray to and have transactional relationships with, who is patriarchal and hierarchical and interested in sort of this sin theology, have evolved beyond that as a human race in great part. And so to circle back before we close, religious systems oftentimes only catch up when culturally the law requires it. There is profound social pressure. Their social capital, they have loss of social capital because the gap of what they're choosing to believe is so very different than the culture around them. And also, as you sort of mentioned, Nathan, attrition or loss of financial capital that comes because of attrition. So those are very, in some ways, more philosophical, but some also very pragmatic reasons why churches finally say we can't survive anymore if we continue to be racist, or we can't survive anymore until we give women equal access to leadership positions or whatever. And I thought that was interesting for us to throw in, because in some ways we wanted to I want to keep us like thinking about the evolution of consciousness and how legitimacy religions, there's a place for them, because that is a part of the evolution of consciousness. In other words, people have to experience a legitimacy, like part of their identity. And if they choose to be religious or are born into religious families, they will go to those types of churches. And the idea is we want human beings to graduate from and move beyond legitimacy-based identity needs and religious systems so that they can move into transformation like religious systems. And in so doing, this is the way that humanity spirals upward into a better understanding of who we are spiritually. So in our next episode, where we are going to be jumping into is we're going to dive into several specific places where religion and politics are actually confronting the very same human issues. We've started talking about this today, but we're going to go much deeper into this in our next episode. So we will see you then. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Latter-day Struggles. If this podcast has supported your faith journey, we invite you to explore the many ways you can continue your healing and growth with us. On our website, you'll find support and processing groups, marriage and parenting courses, and free resources to support where you are in your faith journey. You can also join Valerie in the live fellowship gatherings throughout the year, where we connect, process the podcast, and build meaningful friendships with others on similar paths. If cost has ever been a barrier, we offer podcast scholarships funded by listener donations. To explore all of these offerings, visit the link in today's show notes or go to latterdaystruggles.com. And if this podcast has been meaningful to you, leaving a 5-star review is one of the most powerful ways to help others find this work. Latter-day Struggles is proud to be part of the Dialogue Podcast Network.
Dialogue Podcast Network.